All right, so we are going to pick back up where we left off in chapter 3. We're talking about sensation and perception. In the first video, we just sort of looked at broadly what is sensation and perception and what are some of the principles or ideas that surround this topic. So I wanted you to think about sensation and perception. It's sort of like a coin. There's two sides. First we have sensation is when stimulation from our environment comes into contact with our sensory organs, like our eyes, our ears, our nose, our skin, things like that. And perception is our interpretation of that experience. So, we we can all look at, for example, we all individually can look at a piece of art and have that sensation, the image on our retina of seeing the piece of art, but not all of us are going to perceive that event the same way. In fact, some of us may look at the piece of art and say, "Oh, that's beautiful. It's a great piece of art. I would love to have it in my home." And others may look at it and say, "Oh, it's just a bunch of paint and blotches, and I don't understand. Why would anybody want this in their home?" So perception is very much sort of that subjective individual act, and it's kind of what makes us all unique. We all have different perceptions. So we're going to switch gears for this first video, first of two videos on the subject of vision. So I'm breaking vision up into two parts because there's just a lot to vision. We are a visual species. I mean, there's just a tremendous amount of our cortex is dedicated to processing visual stimuli. So I figured that's really important for us to cover that, spend some time covering that. So, if we're going to talk about vision, the first thing we need to talk about is light, because we see via light waves that travel and come into contact with our eyes, and we'll talk more about that process of how we actually see. But light is this electromagnetic energy that our eyes that we use to see. Again, it travels in waves, and much of those waves we just flat out can't see, and I'll explain more in just a sec on the next slide. But what we can see in terms of visible light is determined by certain properties of the wavelength itself. The wavelength, the size of it determines the hue. There's other properties, the height of the wavelength, the length in between between the links itself determines color, the intensity of color, so like the brightness and the hue and things like that. So the actual physical shape of these wavelengths is what determines the different colors that we perceive with our eyes. So this is what I mean by the visible spectrum. If you look down at the bottom of this graph here, here's my mouse, you can see I'm kind of circling this little strip of light. This is all the color that we can see, but by no means is this all of the the spectrum of light or wavelengths. In fact, there's far more sort of wavelengths out there that we just can't see. You look over here, a radar, FM, TV, AM. I don't know where you put Wi-Fi or whatever. Maybe that fits in here too. Or you have gamma rays and X-rays and ultraviolet waves. These are things that we just flat out cannot see. So we can only see this tiny spectrum. I would call it tiny by comparison of visible light. So, and this is what I meant by the physical property in the previous slide. The wavelength itself, the length between two waves is what determines the actual color, its hue. The amplitude, so basically the height of the waves, is what determines how bright it is. And then, the purity determines the saturation. So these are other things that determine kind of within this spectrum what colors we see. It's based on these physical properties of light. So light is an electrical process, electrical chemical process that responds to physical properties of wavelengths. So now we're going to talk about, we talk about light. Well, it has to come into contact with our eye in order for us to see. And so they've really presented this in an odd way, I think. They present all of the sort of parts of the eye and then a picture. So I'm sorry if that's confusing, but I'm going to lay out some of the parts, the important parts, and then I'll actually show you a picture, and hopefully it'll make more sense once you actually see the picture. You can jump ahead in the PowerPoint if you'd like to see the picture as I'm referencing ahead. But so light, we just talked about light. It enters through a very narrow opening. It enters into the pupil, which will open and dilate depending on the sensitivity of light and emotion, things like that. So that'll open up. We have the cornea, which is a transparent eye cover around your eye. keeps the eye safe, protects your eye. It's also one of those things that's really painful if you've ever scratched your cornea or seen anybody with a scratched cornea. It's no fun. It looks like they just got into a fight, to the near death, but luckily they're okay. It's just their cornea. The iris is the muscular part that goes around your eye. It's the colored portion of your eye. It's the part that allows the pupil to open and constrict depending on the amount of light that's coming in. And then of course we have the lens, which is this will change in thickness. It'll adapt, accommodate depending on for depth, or depending on how close or far you are from things, depending on light, other factors as well. So, as I'm saying this aloud, maybe you're thinking to yourself, wow, the human eye kind of sounds like a camera. Well, yeah, that's an apt metaphor, I think, for thinking about the human eye. It's very similar to a camera. There are a lot of moving parts involved. But the result is, seeing images, seeing clearly, ideally clear images when things are working right. I'm sorry, the more on the lens. Sometimes I forget to do all the little bullet points. I apologize, but more on the lens. The image is projected onto the retina. So really, there's a whole process we're going to talk about here in a moment. That our eyes are the first step in this process of vision. And sort of what happens is our eyes gather the sensory information, which is light, and they relay it back to the occipital lobe. The occipital lobe spits back an image to the eye and puts it onto the retina. So it's a really pretty complex process, although it's happening very, very quickly. So more on the eye, we have the retina. The retina is very important because the retina is the home of photoreceptors, and these photoreceptors are the things that allow us to see color, allows us to see black and white, shades, things like that. You have rods, cones, bipolar cells, ganglion cells. All of these are important for the process of you being able to see light. So you have your bipolar cells. These are the ones. These are simply just neurons in the eyes that conduct neural impulses from rods to the cones to ganglion cells. So it's sort of this process, kind of like a chain of events. Your ganglion cells are neurons who they send the message to the optic nerve, which we haven't talked about yet. So it kind of goes light to rods to cones to bipolar cells to ganglion cells, and then to the occipital lobe, and then back to your eyes, which you see. Okay, so the optic nerve, haven't talked about that, just sort of introduced it just now. It is this nerve, it is a series of nerves, or a nerve that connects the brain to the eyeball, your eyes, your actual physical eyes, to your brain, to the occipital lobe. It's what sends information to the occipital lobe. We also have, this is a little more information than you necessarily need for this course, but hey, it'll be good. It'll be good for you if you're at a party and you really want to sound smart. You have amacrine cells and horizontal cells. These also make connections with rods and cones and the ganglion cells. They're part of this whole process of facilitating light to the brain back to the eyes, or light to the eyes to the brain back to the eyes. So this will make a little more sense in the next slide when you see an actual diagram of the human eye. Here's all that stuff I was talking about. Here we have that cornea, the protective surface. Here we have the pupil, which is going to open and close depending on the amount of light. The iris that surrounds it, the colored portion of your eye. The lens, which will accommodate. You have your retina, which is all where the rods and cones are. The fovea, this is where a big concentration of cones, rods and cones are. You have a blind spot where there are no rods and cones, where vision is, you are literally blind. If light comes into contact with this portion of the eye, you can't see it. And this is kind of, again, down into the bottom right-hand corner of this image is what's going on, the steps going on. We have light rays from the environment, making contact first with the ganglion cells and the amacrine cells, bipolar, horizontal, rods and cones, and then this goes on. We have the optic nerve. So, really the steps and all this aren't important, but just know that it is a very complex process. It's not just, hey, we open our eyes and we see. There's a lot going on below the surface in terms of how our eye is working. It's really doing a stand-up job of processing a lot of information very quickly. So, that's